Hello, everybody, and welcome to our meetup. I am so pleased to have you all here with us today. My name is Alyssa Hunt, and I am a programming coordinator at the Alice Paul Institute. And here with us is Ismail Smith-Wade-El, who is president of Lancaster, Pennsylvania's City Council. We are going to wait just another minute or two for to give everyone a chance to hop on, and then Ismail is going to introduce himself and launch right in. If you guys would like to pop over to the chat box, you can introduce yourselves as well and tell us where you're signing on from. And during our presentation, so we're going to spend about 20 minutes of Izzy talking to us, and then we're going to have a Q&A discussion moment. So if you will just go to the Q&A tab that you should be able to see at the top right of your screen, you can type your questions there, and we will be reading them out.
Hey, everybody. So I'll just, right, I guess there's no waiting room and we're live. I'll just go ahead and start talking to you guys. First, just let me say it is obviously an honor to be here, and I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk to you and to people in general about gerrymandering, because it's an issue that, frankly, doesn't get enough attention on either a federal or state level, especially when the world is on fire, as it seems to be right now. So we can just recap from the year. There were wildfires, right, in Australia. And we just finished up with wildfires in California. There was almost World War III. We had murder hornets. And then a pandemic, and then, as is sort of de rigueur for the United States of America, a few Black people were unceremoniously killed. There were international protests, and now we're staring down a presidential election, and it's hard with all of that to sort of have our eyes on what are the real structural changes that we can make to make long-term improvements in our democracy. And I think the way that I said that to someone just the other day was, it's hard to think about improving the American experiment when sometimes it feels like the human experiment is coming to an end. So I appreciate all of you taking the time to talk a little bit about the American experiment today. I'm scrolling through the chat box, and I'm seeing that we were coming from New Jersey, Washington, Colorado, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So that's great. So with all of that, like Alyssa said, Ismail Smith-Wade-El, I am in brief a Democratic political operative here in the state or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And I'll start by saying that gerrymandering has sort of three levels of relevance to my life. The first is, obviously, as somebody who tries to win elections and help other people win elections, it has a specific relevance to that. As a citizen who wants to be able to choose his own elected officials and not the other way around, it matters to me. And indeed, as we'll talk a little bit about, as an African-American person, it has a real significance to my life generally, and to the history of African-American voting in the United States. As if it becomes relevant in the Q&A section, and just to sort of do it because I like to do it at the top of every talk, I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. I am fine with either. So gerrymandering, sort of broadly defined, is the practice of intentionally establishing an undue political advantage for a particular party, group, or caucus by manipulating the boundaries of a given district. Now, this is usually most applicable to what we call first past the post elections. That's what we have. So the person with the largest number of votes, or for example, the first person to get an exclusionary number of votes, as with the Electoral College, is then the victor of the election, which differs from ranked choice systems in which gerrymandering is not, totally non-existent, but does remain, is less of a factor. So as I said earlier, I like to say that gerrymandering is a process by which elected officials choose their constituents instead of constituents choosing their elected officials. And I'll be very honest with you, it's very tempting. I think there are a lot of things that are challenging about politics. And just like the way that if you were doing a dissertation of defense or if you had a job interview, you might want to be able to pick the people that are interviewing or hiring you for a job, especially if your best friend works at the company. And I would not begrudge you that. But the thing is, and I think you'll agree, is that national politics and even local politics, where a lot of the governing gets done, are really too important for us just to be saying, okay, well, we'll let our friends vote us into office. And frankly, it helps us avoid some really, that is to say, doing away with or installing practices against gerrymandering helps us do away with some really troubling reifications of assumptions around race and gender. So where I'll start with a brief history of gerrymandering that's not going to get all the points, but it's going to get some of the high points. So let's start with the phrase gerrymander. So this is fun. The phrase gerrymander originates with an 1812 political cartoon. The governor of Massachusetts at the time was a Democratic Republican. So there's a hyphen. That's one name. That's one political party. Named Elbridge Gerry. And as is determined by the Constitution of the United States, it is the legislatures of the states that apportion districts. That's going to come up later as we talk about the Supreme Court. But Elbridge Gerry, as governor, signed off on a map for the congressional districts in the state of Massachusetts to help his friends in the Massachusetts Democratic Republican Party get those seats. And I haven't pulled an image of this up yet, but I will real quickly just so you can see it because it's incredible. The second part of the portmanteau there is salamander. So if you'll bear with me just a second, I'll briefly share my screen. Can you, I don't know if you all can see that. Alyssa, can you clue me in? Can you see the whole image in the browser there?
It says it is loading on my screen.
Okay.
There it is.
Okay. So if you can see it, the bottom of it is cut off for me. But, in the mythical sense where a salamander refers to a kind of dragon, Elbridge Gerry's political opponents referred to this sort of winged beast from Salisbury down to Marblehead as the gerrymander. And so that kind of mythical creature is where the phrase gerrymandering comes from, because, we have this idea of an obviously ridiculous political district created for the obvious purpose of getting a particular person or party into an elected office. Okay, so we'll take a step forward. We're going to jump forward about 150 years. So in 1865, Congress passed a pretty important piece of legislation that we call the Voting Rights Act now. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 determined a number of things, but really set out to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, as well as the 19th, to the Constitution to ensure that people indeed had the voting rights that they were guaranteed by the Constitution. So think of it as if the Constitution is the school handbook there, the Voting Rights Act is the hall monitor, and empowered the federal government to do a number of things to ensure that, to quote, the Negro had the equal, equitable, and accessible right to vote. So Section 2 is maybe one of the most important parts. Really, when people talk about the Voting Rights Act, they talk about Sections 2 and 5. Section 2 prohibits discrimination of, I believe the language is racial and linguistic minorities. So they can't tell you you can't vote because you're African American, and they can't tell you that you can't vote because you speak Spanish or Tagalog or. Section 5 has more to do with the enforcement of that, and together they are understood to both specifically and by inference address the question of racial gerrymandering. So that is to say, specifically saying, I am going to put all of the African American and Latino voters over here so that I don't really have to consider their votes in this election. So the racial vote dilution is what Section 2, among others, of the Voting Rights Act is about. Now, that gets a little complicated because the court, SCOTUS, later affirmed, I'm sorry, I try not to just throw out abbreviations. SCOTUS is the Supreme Court of the United States, if we're not all tracking. The court later affirmed that there was a space in which what they refer to as an affirmative racial gerrymander was an option. So that is to say, you could redistrict previously unfair districts to ensure that African Americans did have the electoral power that they were due. And that's what's big about the Voting Rights Act, is that it considers not just the one person, one vote. It considers voting rights as something that we're entitled to as individuals and as members of a group. So the general sense is that if a gerrymander or a redistricting is found to be primarily motivated by race over, I believe the opinion reads, compactness, contiguity, and respect for political subdivisions or communities defined by actual shared interests. And there are actually 5 or 6 Supreme Court cases trying to suss out what actual shared interest really means, that they constitute racial gerrymandering and are subject to a standard that we in legal terms call strict scrutiny. That is, that they must show a compelling state interest for why they do it. And I want to win an election is not itself a compelling state interest. So, to make it a little more specific, recent examples in Ohio and North Carolina have found, actually by way of actual documentation or recordings, that the North Carolina and Ohio Republican parties were engaged in racial gerrymandering, where they took African American voters essentially as a proxy for Democrats and said, okay, well, we know that the African American voters are here, so we need to move them one way or another to ensure that we continue to win elections. So Republicans in those states were able to guarantee themselves not just majorities, but supermajorities of their local House and Senate and domination of their congressional delegation. Let me break that down for you a little bit. So most states have what's called a bicameral legislature. That just means that there are 2 parts to it. So they have a House and a Senate, like Pennsylvania, like North Carolina, like Virginia, like Ohio. So they were able to really secure that for themselves. And then legal challenges came along, determining them to be racial gerrymanders. What's interesting about this is that federal courts first ruled on North Carolina's districting plan and said that this was unconstitutional. It violates the it violates the Voting Rights Act and the North Carolina state constitution. It went all the way to the Supreme Court on a series of appeals, where last year, and actually after the map had been thrown out, last year it was determined that federal courts don't actually have that jurisdiction, that the part of the Constitution that relegates that power to the states puts it in the hand of not federal courts, but state courts. And fortunately for those of us who do not like gerrymandering, the North Carolina state courts also determined that these constituted racial gerrymanders in violation of the Constitution. So that changes up the map significantly just in time for a new series of congressional elections in 2020 and 2022. And I really can't overstate the importance of this. We typically think of these in terms of congressional districts, but I can have way more power over what happens in my state, in my little corner of the United States, if I control how the state legislatures are drawn rather than the federal ones. In the state of Pennsylvania, I'll go ahead and out myself like as a big lefty. Issues like healthcare, issues like rent control or even modifying rents, issues like the minimum wage, clean streams, clean air, fracking. All of these things are determined not by the federal government, but by the state government, who in Pennsylvania, and as I'm rolling through the list of states in the chat box, in most of your states have what are called preemption laws. So that is to say that your state legislature has come through and said, we don't want cities or municipalities to be determining the minimum wage, certain housing laws, police union contracts for themselves. We want, we want those to fall within certain boundaries. So I missed a step, something that I specifically wanted to mention because I did see that somebody is joining us from Sioux Falls. Hi, Amy. So an interesting note on the history of gerrymandering is, again, we're talking about unfair district drawing to offer a numerical advantage to any particular party. So in the middle of the 19th century, when the Dakota Territory was admitted to the United States, Republicans pushed heavily to have it admitted not as one territory, but as two, giving a numerical advantage, which to some historians constitute a significant, literally nation-changing instance of gerrymandering, in fact. So that's something that I have found really fascinating. So I know I took a lot of time there. Moving right along, I next want the opportunity to show you some of what we're talking about when we say, when we say that these are really quite ridiculous looking districts. I'm going to share my screen again with you. So if you can, I've still got the PowerPoint markers up there, I apologize. So if you can see some of these districts, first we've got the Massachusetts 7th, which you'll see takes a big scoop out of the state of Massachusetts and, consists of a almost random seeming series of islands. We've got the Texas 33rd, which just skips Arlington without including Dallas or anything that's happening in Cannondale, Mansfield. We've got my absolute favorite. I love talking about gerrymandering just so I can talk about Illinois' 4th district. We call this the earmuffs because, as you can see, you've got this area around Chicago and this area, but everything in Oak Park and Hillside, we're just going to go ahead and exclude that. And you can see some of these connections are almost impossibly thin. This is one of the most egregious examples of gerrymandering in the United States. Next is the former district drawing of the Pennsylvania 16th. That's home for me here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So before the 2018 redistricting in the state of Pennsylvania, my congressional district looked like this. So here's Lancaster County. This is all Lancaster County. This is a little cutout of Chester County to include Coatesville, and these little itsy bitsy parts of Berks County to include Reading. Finally, we have North Carolina's 4th district. Oh, this is cut off. Let me see if I can get out of the slideshow so you can see it a little better. So you see it including Raleigh here, and Chapel Hill, but intentionally excluding areas in the middle here. So the reason that these things are often done is, again, to concentrate or dilute a particular set of voters from a part of the electorate. And here's why that's important. Gerrymandering typically takes two forms. The first is cracking, colloquially called cracking. And that essentially is to divide members of a political group or party or a racial demographic up so that they don't have as much power in a given district or within a given series of districts. So if, for example, I saw that there was a large concentration of African American voters in, let's say Coatesville. And so I chose to draw a line. Coatesville is in Chester County, which is a collar county of Philadelphia, if you're not familiar with Pennsylvania. And I chose to draw a line for electing state house positions right in the middle of Coatesville, knowing that I could sort of put those urban voters in two districts and they would not be able to elect a representative in either of the two districts that they've been split between. That is cracking. The other version is called packing, which is really to say, oh, I see that there are a number of small cities which may have urban voters, which is almost always code for African American and Latino voters. So as you saw with the Pennsylvania 16th, pulling Coatesville, Lancaster, and Reading into one district to essentially isolate them and combine them within one heavily Republican district so that Coatesville and Reading are less likely to swing their congressional districts in less heavily Republican areas for the Democrats. So I will say, now that we sort of understand cracking and packing and sort of how gerrymandering takes place, I think I'm under obligation to say that it's not just Republicans that engage in gerrymandering. Democrats absolutely do it, and we'll talk in a second about how that differs, but Democrats absolutely do it, and probably the most egregious example of Democrats participating in gerrymandering is the state of Maryland, which has been Democrat controlled for years, and so they use their control of redistricting to remain in control, in supermajority even, sort of until the next redistricting, which, by the way, this is a good opportunity to remind you to fill out your census forms, because you will be probably redistricted based on the census data. So what's interesting is that Republicans tend to redistrict in one particular way, and Democrats tend to redistrict in another. There's a really great map I'm going to show you here on the 538, if you can see that, which allows you to go through how you might redistrict the United States based on a series of priorities. So if you want compactness, that is that they form like solid recognizable shapes, you can toy with that. If you want highly competitive elections, you can toy with that. When you look at the history of how districts are shaped to favor Republicans, they tend to isolate Democrats into specific small areas, essentially giving up those districts to ensure that they will have other Republican districts elsewhere. Democrats tend to do that less so, more creating mixed districts which they believe lean Democrat and in which they will be successful. If I were going to give you a political answer, I would say that's because Democrats are, less gung-ho about brazen political engineering, and we have a stronger sense of political ethics, blah, blah, blah. The real reason is very simply that, yes, Alyssa?
Oh, I was just gonna wait. I have a question.
Oh, yeah, go.
Lauren Slusser asks, why don't voting district lines simply match the county lines? Does it have to do with population numbers?
That is an excellent question. So, Alyssa, is the screen showing this map on the webpage here?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So here it is. This is the map for making districts compact while following existing county borders. That's a strong and very common suggestion. And so if we take a look at the map here, you'll notice that if you balance population and compactness and county lines, that as we get further out west, you'll see where you might have a district that is just, here's the whole state, or it might be 2 in the whole state. Now, this is a neat solution for the most part, but county lines in the balance between Republicans and Democrats favor Republicans in some places and Democrats in the others. And I think part of the reason that we haven't gone to county lines is that no one wants to do that on a national level, in large parts because it could deleteriously affect how those things are done to benefit a given party within their state. So, for example, in our home of Pennsylvania, that might not improve the odds of Democrats. Whereas in California, it might create a couple more usually Republican districts, but would be very bad for general congressional representation in the state of California. It might do you better for Democrats in the state of Texas. And so because these things are operating not just on a national level, and indeed they can't because states apportion their own districts within certain guidelines, provinciality tends to reign. So a general rule which would be broad across the entire country and that would negatively affect a state party in one direction or another tends to not fly. So it's really a combination of population mathematical reasons and political reasons. Yes. So like I was saying, when we gerrymander districts to favor Democrats, we create some of these more coalition districts as a general practice. And it's not because Democrats are more ethical, though I'm sure we'll try to tell you that. It's really because Republicans are more spread out and Democrats tend to be more concentrated in cities and suburbs. So we could not, in gerrymandering, most places, effectively isolate Republicans to specific locations. So the approaches that are taken to districting are often based on just the political reality of trying to gain an advantage. So I'll pause here for a question before moving into my tail end. I realize I've been talking for a while. Is there anything anybody's burning to ask?
Well, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
It seems a little hopeless with the way you're describing the situation, and because whoever's in charge of a given state having the power to create those districts, what can be done to stop, how often is redistricting done? Every time a different party takes control of the state legislature, can they just redistrict to their advantage to sort of instantiate their supermajority? That's what happened where I used to live in North Carolina.
So it does feel pretty hopeless. So let me start with a big picture item. Some of the best analysis on this suggests that of the changes in elected seats at the state house level and above, so it doesn't include glorified dog catchers like myself on city council or county tax collectors, but if you look at state house members, state senate members, congressional representatives, and senators, about 25% of the change in those seats in the past 20 years could possibly be attributed to gerrymandering. So that's not everything, but it's not nothing. 20%, for example, of the United States Senate and the United States the United States House is universal health care. That's it. That's the vote. Unless, of course, you have a president that vetoes it, which, anyway, I'll move past that. So I don't want to give the impression that gerrymandering is the whole political enchilada, but if you can move 20% at one time, of course you're going to take that opportunity, and it's huge. So most places, redistricting can happen when the party in power chooses to use a new legislative map at the state house and state senate levels. Federal redistricting happens usually every 10 years after the decennial census. Also, redistricting comes about after court challenges. Usually, as in the state of Pennsylvania and in your home state of North Carolina, maps will be redrawn after a given court, usually the Supreme Court of your state, finds a given map to be illegal or unconstitutional. So where that is the case, there will be a redrawing of the map, and it will last usually until at maximum 2 years, when there's another opportunity for the redrawing of that state level map. So
forgive me.
No, thank you. So one of the best two options that we have, and I'll shout out here in Pennsylvania, Fair Districts PA, to overcome gerrymandering is to take it out of the hands of political parties. California, Oregon, and other states do their redistricting using ostensibly nonpartisan citizen commissions. So persons are elected in equal measure, so a certain number of Democrats, a certain number of Republicans, and in some states, a requisite number of independents. And they come together using formulas, maps, knowledge of the communities to vote on proposed maps or create their own and determine which ones are most effective. This really gets to the heart not just of the problem, but also of the narrative. This is a good example of citizens choosing their elected officials and choosing their maps instead of the other way around. The other big option, I think, is just doing it mathematically. Having an independent office, maybe an organ of your state government, that does it based on an algorithm, not unlike, for example, the map we saw here. I'll pop back to it. When we said, we wanted to make districts compact while following county borders. And that can happen both for congressional districts as well as local districts. Forgive me, I'll give you Pennsylvania, for example. So here we are prioritizing county borders, and here's home, for example. So this is Lancaster County and part of Chester County. Prioritizing those things over any other concerns. Now, doing it mathematically is, I think, purely mathematically, is the less likely of two options. And the reason that I say that's the case is that looking at the political reality, I think your representative might vote for an independent citizen commission. I think it's unlikely that they would vote for a purely mathematical approach, not just because it wouldn't allow them to stay in power, but that there is a real argument that a purely mathematical approach does not effectively represent the people. So if we look at this one, just addressing county borders, this hard red district contains Harrisburg, it contains Lebanon, it may even contain York City. No, I don't think it does. But you'll see here that this is a district which contains tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of African American and Latinx voters. And I don't know if you can see the pop-up, but the chance of being represented by a member of a racial or ethnic minority in that district is 1.4%. So this is one way in which just a pure we're going to make compact county lines does not actually serve the goal of better representation if you believe that African American communities and Latinx communities should be addressed specifically in the odds of their being represented by somebody who shares their demographic makeup or their interest, and that's a matter of some significant contention. Another good example are Lancaster, Berks, Chester, Delco, Montco, and York counties, which have very significant and growing Black and Latinx populations, where this map would not serve at least those Black and Latinx populations particularly at all. Yeah. So I will encourage each of you to get in touch with a fair districts or redistricting group in any of your states or communities. There is almost certainly one because and I'll bring this home in this way. Because gerrymandering, or at least drawing districts that only consider whether a particular party or a particular elected official is in power. So in California, you have what you might call uniquely reprehensible prior to their redistricting commissions, and depending on who you ask, sometimes after, bipartisan agreements for what's called incumbent gerrymandering. So some Democrats and some Republicans get together and they say, okay, we're going to keep the districts the way that we want to because we want to prioritize keeping people in office who are currently in office. And we're going to draw the districts in such a way that not only will the general election change, but we're going to isolate districts to make primary challenges difficult. And that's an absolute disservice to one of the key functions of democracy. But we also see that, in particular, racial and gender parity in actual representation really suffer from gerrymandering. In particular, actually, the growing crop of Republican women running for office, because when parties tend to gerrymander, as a rule, they tend to gerrymander to the outer edges of their party. So at least center left or center right or further, right? Like nobody gerrymanders socialist, but you don't tend to, can't say never, gerrymander to blue dog Democrats, at least moderate, for example. But where you create an extremely conservative district, woman candidates, or even women who are currently in office, who tend to be more moderate and, as a lot of research shows, more willing to compromise in a solution-oriented way when they are elected, regardless of what their party is, that women candidates suffer. And if you look at analysis from the League of Women Voters now and the 538, you'll see varying estimates that as many, but up to as many of 20% of the women candidates that have run have been negatively affected by gerrymandering. So that's not just that we suffer, that women candidates suffer, but I would go so far as to argue that our democracy suffers by excluding people who are frankly socialized to be more effective legislators. As I said, women are more likely to compromise. They're more likely to focus on solutions, actually getting things done over parties. And as you know, a man in elected office and frankly a personal ideologue, I do recognize the value of really, sticking to your guns and raising a message no matter what. But somebody, we have a lot of, and we've seen this with the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of powerful women pushing on the ideological edges, moving the narrative forward. And we should also empower women, pardon me, in the space where we need to come together to find solutions, and where gerrymandering keeps us from electing women, it keeps us that much from doing that. I think I've gone wildly over my time.
Well, so we actually have another question. A couple questions popped up while you were talking, but I feel like you addressed them pretty effectively. Amy Scott Stoltz asked about an independent redistricting commission, and Lillian Crawley asked about a computer program and whether that would make redistricting more fair and impartial. I feel like you covered that pretty thoroughly, but Lucy Beard wants to know how you got into this work and what led you to this position.
Yeah, let me, Lucy, I want to answer that question, and I will in just a second. To address the computer program question, again, it goes back to the algorithm piece, and I just want to say aloud, oftentimes where we design things, we put our own racial biases into them, and our own gender biases, et cetera, what is and isn't important, what does and doesn't constitute a compact district or a shared interest or an urban-rural suburban boundary. We do have to make determinations on those things because they are social constructs. And so a computer program could very well, not that it's not a great idea, carry those biases forward. Amy, no, not Amy, was it Lucy that asked the question about how I got into this work?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for bearing with Alyssa. So I got into this work because of my dear mother, God rest her soul, who was a very impassioned educator and fighter who taught me early on that all the things that matter to me in life are ultimately political. So either I could be on the outside pushing the boundaries, I could be on the inside working for solutions, some combination of the two of those, but that frankly an apolitical life, especially as an African-American man, was not a luxury that I had. So in 2016, when volunteering on the Clinton campaign, I got involved with the Lancaster County Democratic Committee, and then the following year ended up running for city council with a really great coalition of colleagues, and from there moved pretty directly into work at the county and state Democratic levels. I'm also a member of the Pennsylvania State Democratic Committee. So these kind of statewide organizing efforts are huge to me because I believe that, you can be sort of whose motto is it? I think it's Wake Forest, Vox Clementis in Deserto. You can be like a single voice crying out in the wilderness. But if you take the time to build the team, you're going to be a lot more effective. If I had to go all the way back to like my first engagement with political organizing, I got dragged by the Pittsburgh AFL-CIO into some college door knocking against an advancement of a right to work proposal that would bring Pennsylvania's right to work laws even further, I think, out of bounds. And really undercut unions in the state, which as a Democrat and the son of a college professor are very important to me. So thank you for that question. I see Paul's question in the chat box, and I am now pulling up a picture of the Pennsylvania 11. So if you'll just bear with me for a moment, Paul, I will share my screen. Sorry, I rolled right over it. And now it's, Alyssa, would you read the question? It's disappeared for me.
Yeah, you showed the previous Lancaster area district and mentioned it was redistricted recently. And the question was, can you show the differences and who was responsible for the redistricting? And right before that, Amy Scott Stoltz had also asked if there had been successful legal challenges to party gerrymandering at a state level, which I believe North Carolina was a good example of that, when the courts were pinging the cases back and forth from federal to state.
Right.
And the redistricting that happened in North Carolina that made it impossible for Republicans to lose the General Assembly was deemed unconstitutional, and they had to redo some campaigns last year. They had to redo some elections because the way it had been drawn was deemed completely unfair, and I think that's going to play out in this fall's elections in a pretty significant way there.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So actually, I can answer both of these questions at the same time, fortunately. So in the screen, you now see what is the Pennsylvania 11th. So where previously, actually, hold up, I have it on the PowerPoint, but I'm going to bring up District 16. That's not, yeah, Pennsylvania House of Representatives, District 16. We're going to look at a picture of it. Hold on. Bear with me a second. Let's see, the last redistricting. Okay, so, oh, nope, it's taking me to the current one. That's great. So, okay, here we have this bad boy with a chunk taken out of his tail side. And here we have the new district, which covers that same area, or where the primary county is Lancaster County. So you can see on this side, it's much more along county lines, right, here and here. It no longer includes this little cutout into Reading, which was previously here, and instead includes part of southern York County seen here. Now, so what you have is a combination of a county boundary, Lancaster, alongside a shared community districting definition, which includes southern York County. Now, this is one that, frankly, this is a district that when there was a court challenge to the way the Pennsylvania's districts were drawn in 2018 that ultimately resulted in the redistricting, this is a district that actually got less fair instead of more fair. So the courts essentially kicked it back to the legislature because of the successful state challenge and said, you must come up with a map which more comports with the laws and guidelines that you have. So they did that. Again, we have a county boundary and a shared community, Southern York County and Lancaster County. And this is a district that got more heavily Republican. And if you're from Lancaster County or were familiar with Jess King's race in the Pennsylvania 11th, you'll know that was a really energetic campaign, but that one that was set an even bigger challenge than the one that they previously had. So yes, there have been multiple successful state court challenges to gerrymandering, and based on the Rucho versus Common Cause decision, this is the 2019 one that dealt with the North Carolina and Maryland congressional districts. In the future, most of them are probably going to come at the state level and not at the federal court level, since SCOTUS, again, that's the Supreme Court of the United States, has determined that federal courts don't really have jurisdiction. So there have been successful state challenges, yes, and sometimes that'll make a lot of districts more fair or lean them towards another party. Other districts will get less fair or lead toward the other party because, again, even within any legal boundary of fairness you can enforce, people are going to try to push their political or party interests.
So, Izzy, before we wrap up, which we're going to have to do pretty soon here, we have one more question that I would like for you to address. Janice Scheffler lives in Coatesville and is thanking you for the presentation. But Tara Harris, who is from Medford, New Jersey, is asking about Texas. which has a large African American and Latinx population, but leans Republican in presidential elections. Can you speak to that at all? Why that is the case?
So in presidential elections, that one's electoral college is done state by state, and more Republicans turn out to vote for president than do Democrats, is the simple, easy answer. So if I break that down a little bit, there's a couple of things there. So, and I want to answer a question you didn't ask right after this, but so you're looking at a number of things. You're looking at voter suppression, voter disenfranchisement, voter disaffection. That is to say, they never really got motivated to vote in the first place, or they became demotivated from voting for any number of economic, social, psychological, or political factors. And when I say voter disenfranchisement or suppression, that is because Texas has put a lot of effort into closing down polling places or preventing people from access the information or the identification that they need to vote in several, in several controversial legislative actions over the past 10 to 15 years. And the reason that they've done that, Keturah, is specifically because they recognize that growing African American and Latino population, and need a way to turn that over at the presidential level. Because if you're a Republican Party strategist and you know that the Democrats have a lock on California and New York, if the next year the Democrats take Texas, it becomes comically challenging to win a presidential election ever again. And so, there is definitely effort put into, not just in gerrymandering, but in other forms of disenfranchisement to make sure that certain populations, which tend to vote Democrat, do not vote as frequently, as a simple matter of cynical political strategy with some racism and bias mixed in. So the question that you didn't ask is where gerrymandering becomes incredibly relevant is with growing African American and Latinx populations in Texas. You would think that you would see more Black and Latinx congressional and state Senate and state House representation. And that's where gerrymandering is keeping Black and brown people out of political representation in Texas in a very obvious way. I think an independent redistricting of the state of Texas would lead to a lot more representation of Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and a lot of the border areas in terms of Black and brown representation, which would lead to more Democrats and different political outcomes, which the Republicans in that state oppose as a matter of strategy and politics.
It's a very thorough answer. Thank you. And with that, I think we have been here almost an hour. So unless we have any final questions from anybody, and there's a brief lag, which I forgot to tell you about earlier. So we'll wait just a moment to see if we have a final question. And otherwise, I think we will wrap up. I want to thank all of you for giving us so much of your time, a full hour on a Tuesday afternoon. Izzy, I want to thank you for coming and talking to us and sharing your insight and experience. This was really, I learned a lot. This was really, really fascinating, and I think touched upon a lot of issues that we often think of as peripheral that are actually very deeply interconnected. And it's really important for us to remember that not only are our struggles, intersectional, but so is the way forward, and so are our strategies. So our strategies need to be.
I think that's exactly right. So thank you to you, Alyssa, and thank you to the Alice Paul Institute, because people do need an opportunity to get more educated and engaged on these things. I'll say this before signing off. Everybody, there is almost certainly an independent redistricting movement, either on the ballot or a nonprofit that's organizing to get it on the ballot in your state. And political movements, Haymarket, LGBTQ, civil rights, whatever you have, are made up of people who showed up and organized and did the work. So if anything that we've talked about today seems really egregious or really relevant to life in your state and you want to make a difference, just dive in. And thank you.
Thank you, Izzy, and take care. And everyone, if you want to follow up, if you want to watch this again, if you want to show it to someone who wasn't here, you can just hop back onto our big marker. This we will, in a few days, we will publish this talk and it will be available. Eventually, it will be available on our YouTube channel. We are working on getting these talks uploaded there. And Izzy, if anyone wanted to get back in touch with you, how could they do that?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead real quick and type my email into the chat box, and I'll say it here. You can reach me at ismailmsmith@gmail.com. That's a lot, but it is ismailmsmith@gmail.com. You can look me up on Facebook, where I'm Counselor Ismail Smith-Wade-El on Facebook, and I am pretty swamped these days in terms of responding to emails and communications. But if you send me a message or an email, I will absolutely get back to you in due time. So,
and feel free to reach out to programs@alicepaul.org with follow-up questions as well.
All right. Great, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.